All right. In this video, what I wanted to do was introduce the book by David Buss, When Men Behave Poorly or Badly. And in this book, it's going to be a lot different than Walter de Casaretti's book. Remember, Walter's approach to family violence and interpersonal violence really takes on a feminist and critical perspective. So it was really heavy on sociology and the social context that makes up interpersonal violence. This book is written by David Buss, and David Buss is a psychologist. And so he approaches the idea of violence and conflict a little bit different than Walter does. And I think what's really good about that is this gives us now a little bit better of a well-rounded introduction to violence, kind of first focusing on the social context and now bringing in a little bit more of a social psychological perspective. And I think David Buss does that pretty well. He's a very well-known academic, and this is a new book that he just came out with, so it really does include a lot of the most recent and up-to-date literature. So when we're talking about conflict and violence, according to David Buss, he's really bringing in this idea of sexual conflict and sexual selection. So as a psychologist, he's really taking on an evolutionary biology perspective and suggesting that conflict, particularly between men and women, is due to this idea of sexual selection, that there is a interference between males and females to get what they want out of a mating partner. And so from this psychologist perspective, it is focusing on individual differences. So why are men and women so different in the way that they behave, especially when looking at violence and conflict? And so individual differences are those reasons why men and women are very different in the way that they go about things like sexual harassment, internet dating, workplace violence, sexual coercion, and that could be across strangers, dating partners, and mates that we have and mate long-term with. So for this book, and what we're going to be talking about here is that males are the ones with small gametes, right, sperm, and females are the ones with larger gametes, eggs. Now, this is a very biological sort of dichotomous way of thinking about males and females, and we won't get into a lot more of the more nuanced way that we now define gender, particularly from a sociological perspective, because this is a evolutionary biology perspective, a psychological perspective. We really are thinking very dichotomously about males and females and who those individuals are. And the differences that we find when we relate it back to violence are rooted in reproductive biology. And that reproductive biology has created a selection pressure for sex differences in sexual psychology, meaning that the way that men and women behave has been advantageous in the past for passing on that genetic material. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that everybody does or everything that males do or females do is always advantageous, especially not now in current society. But in the past, it is rooted in the idea that these are strategies, and they may be violent strategies as well, but they have been successful in some ways in passing on genetic material, which from an evolutionary perspective is the reason why we do anything, is to pass on that genetic material. So we use introspection about our minds and infer that to understand what other people are thinking about themselves and why they behave the way that they do and why they perceive other people to do what they do. So it really is, I know what I think, I believe something about what other people think about me and what they do. And the reason that I believe those things is because my mind has been developed by evolution to understand what other people are thinking. So it's this introspection about our minds, and we infer what he calls this inner landscape of other people's minds. So the introduction to this book really sets up the foundation for looking at individual differences between males and females and rooting those differences in sexual selection. And as we move forward, you're going to see how that plays a part in family and interpersonal violence.